Disclaimer. This video is a historical documentary created for educational, informational, and awareness purposes. It discusses real-world events, including themes of colonialism, war, and human rights abuses, which may be disturbing to some viewers. All visuals are dramatized, digitally created, or symbolic, and do not depict actual individuals unless explicitly stated. This content does not promote violence, discrimination, or political agendas. Viewer discretion is advised. In a quiet hall in Berlin, far from the red soil of Africa, the fate of an entire continent was decided with ink, paper, and rulers. The year was 1884. The men gathered around the table were dressed in waistcoats and uniforms, their fingers stained with tobacco and colonial ambition. They weren't kings of African nations. They weren't tribal leaders. They weren't even visitors to the lands they were about to divide. They were European diplomats and bureaucrats, German, British, Belgian, French, and they had a singular goal: to carve Africa into pieces that suited their empires. There were no Africans in the room. Not a single voice to speak for the kingdoms that had stood for centuries. No one to object when sacred lands were assigned like properties on a board game. No one to stop the bleeding before it began. What unfolded over the following months was called the Berlin Conference. To some, it was a diplomatic success, a way to avoid war among European powers. But to those who would feel its impact, it marked the beginning of something far more sinister: the scramble for Africa. Within just a few decades, over 90% of Africa would be under European control. Kingdoms fell, cultures shattered, entire populations enslaved, worked to death, or erased. Yet this story, one of the most violent land grabs in human history, is rarely told. It is not celebrated in museums or taught in detail in classrooms. But its consequences still shape borders, conflicts, and broken identities across the African continent today. This is the story of how the world's second-largest landmass was taken with pen and paper, and how millions paid in blood for the lines they never chose. When most people imagine pre-colonial Africa, they picture scattered tribes, untouched wilderness, and a people waiting for civilization to arrive. This image is not only false, it is dangerous. Before the Berlin Conference, before the scramble, Africa was not a blank slate. It was a continent alive with ancient cities, thriving trade, and powerful empires, many of which rivaled or surpassed their European counterparts in wealth, technology, and governance. In West Africa, the Ashanti Empire boasted a centralized bureaucracy, a professional army, and architecture that stunned early European visitors. Gold was so abundant in the region that the Portuguese referred to the area as the Gold Coast. Ashanti kings sat on golden stools, symbolizing divine authority, not unlike the thrones of Europe. Further north, the Mali Empire and its legendary ruler Mansa Musa controlled vast territories and trade routes. In 1324, Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca left a mark so deep that he literally destabilized the gold economy of the Mediterranean world, simply by giving too much of it away. His capital, Timbuktu, was not just a city, it was a center of Islamic learning, with libraries and universities centuries before Oxford or Harvard existed. To the east, the Kingdom of Ethiopia, rooted in Christianity since the 4th century, stood as a beacon of independence. Its stone churches, carved into the earth at Lalibela, remain architectural marvels. Ethiopia had its own script, its own dynasties, and its own diplomacy, and it would be the only African nation to successfully repel European colonization. Further south, the Zulu Kingdom, under leaders like Shaka Zulu, engineered military innovations that stunned even British forces. The Zulu weren't tribal. They were tactical, forging alliances, absorbing rivals, and building a formidable nation-state through discipline and strategy. Trade routes laced the continent, not just north-south through the Sahara, but eastward across the Indian Ocean and westward to Europe. African merchants exchanged ivory, textiles, spices, and iron tools for Chinese porcelain and Persian manuscripts. Coastal cities like Kilwa and Mogadishu bustled with markets and mosques. What's more, Africa was not isolated. It was global. So why don't we hear these stories? Because the myth of an uncivilized Africa served a purpose. If colonizers were to justify their conquest, they needed to paint Africa as backwards, a land to be tamed, not respected. Libraries were burned, oral histories silenced, achievements dismissed as Arab or European in origin, and over time, the world believed the lie. But the truth remains buried, sometimes beneath centuries of distortion, sometimes beneath the very cities that still stand. Before the scramble, Africa was not waiting to be discovered. It was thriving, complex, and fiercely proud. And that's exactly what made it such a prize and such a target. In November of 1884, representatives from 13 European nations and the United States gathered in Berlin. The room was filled with maps, cigars, and ambition, but not a single African delegate. Over the course of 3 months, these men would redraw the map of Africa with a ruthless efficiency that still echoes across the continent today. The host of the conference was Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor. Ironically, Germany had only recently unified as a nation itself. Bismarck had little genuine interest in Africa at first, but he saw colonial expansion as a way to gain diplomatic leverage in Europe and distract from internal tensions. Around the table sat France, eager to expand its empire after humiliating losses to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War. Britain, with its eye on securing trade routes from Cairo to Cape Town. Belgium, through King Leopold II, pretended to pursue humanitarian missions, but secretly salivated over the rubber-rich Congo. Portugal, Italy, Spain, and others also jockeyed for scraps, each determined to claim their place in the imperial race. The official purpose of the conference was to avoid conflict between European powers over African territories. The reality? It was a negotiation of theft, designed to turn an entire continent into a resource map. There were no discussions about African governance, no regard for cultural boundaries or ethnic groups. The decisions were purely strategic: rivers for trade, ports for shipping, borders that served European logistics, not African lives. The guiding principle agreed upon was called effective occupation. It meant that a country couldn't just plant a flag. It had to establish actual control: military posts, administrations, roads, settlements. This rule sparked a frenzy. Nations raced to stake claims before their rivals could. Colonies were grabbed not to build societies, but to prevent someone else from doing so first. The most infamous of these claims was King Leopold II's Congo Free State. At the conference, he promised it would be a philanthropic venture, a model of civilization and Christian charity. In truth, it would become one of the most brutal regimes in colonial history. When the conference concluded in February 1885, it had created a blueprint for imperial domination. Within just 2 decades, nearly 90% of Africa would be under European control. The borders drawn in Berlin were unnatural, arbitrary, and often cut straight through existing kingdoms, families, and languages. But to the men in Berlin, Africa was not a continent of people. It was a puzzle of profit. And once the lines were drawn, it was no longer about diplomacy. It was about conquest. And the real cost, in blood, culture, and memory, was just beginning. If you look at a map of Africa today, something immediately stands out: the borders. They're too straight, too geometric, too clean. Unlike the winding rivers or jagged mountain ranges that define boundaries in much of the world, many African borders look like they were drawn with a ruler. That's because they were. During the Berlin Conference, European powers sliced through the continent with no regard for the people who lived there. Over 10,000 distinct ethnic groups, languages, and cultures were ignored. Instead, borders were drawn to satisfy European interests, to divide resources, secure trade routes, and outmaneuver rivals. The result was a cartographic disaster. Whole ethnic groups were split between multiple colonies. The Somali people were divided among British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, French Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Kenya. The Yu people were split between British Gold Coast, now Ghana, and German Togoland, now Togo. Entire kingdoms found themselves straddling new, invisible lines. Overnight, their cultural unity shattered. Worse still, some borders forced rival groups into the same territory, fueling tensions that would boil over in the decades to come. In Rwanda, colonial powers grouped the Hutu and Tutsi under a single administration, reinforcing ethnic divisions through favoritism and manipulation, setting the stage for one of the 20th century's most horrific genocides. The British employed a tactic called divide and rule, deliberately stoking competition between groups to prevent unified resistance. In Nigeria, they pitted the Hausa Fulani in the north against the Yoruba and Igbo in the south. In Sudan, Arab elites were elevated over black Africans. These artificial hierarchies didn't end with colonization. They calcified into deep national wounds. Colonial boundaries also disregarded traditional governance systems. Tribal councils, monarchies, and spiritual authorities were either destroyed or absorbed into colonial bureaucracies that cared little for their legitimacy. The result was not just cultural erasure, but a profound psychological rupture. A sense of identity, of home, was replaced by an imposed nationality that meant little to the people living under it. And when the colonial powers finally left in the mid-20th century, they didn't fix what they broke. Most newly independent African nations were forced to inherit the exact borders created by their colonizers, no matter how illogical or harmful. To redraw them risked civil war. To keep them meant accepting division. It was a no-win scenario, built into the foundation of independence itself. To this day, many of Africa's most persistent conflicts, from the Biafran War in Nigeria to the civil wars in Sudan, Congo, and Somalia, can be traced directly back to these arbitrary lines, drawn in European capitals by men who never set foot on African soil. They didn't see communities. They saw commodities, and the borders they drew still bleed. When the Berlin Conference ended, King Leopold II of Belgium walked away with one of the largest prizes on the map, the Congo Basin, a region larger than Western Europe and unimaginably rich in rubber, ivory, and minerals. He called it the Congo Free State, but it was anything but free. Leopold didn't claim the territory in the name of Belgium. He claimed it for himself, as his private property. He presented his intentions as noble, a civilizing mission, a humanitarian venture to bring Christianity, commerce, and enlightenment to the dark heart of Africa. The international community applauded him. Then the rubber boom began. In the late 19th century, rubber became one of the most valuable resources in the world. With the rise of bicycles, automobiles, and industrial machinery, demand exploded, and the Congo's rubber vines were gold mines. But harvesting rubber was labor-intensive and dangerous, and Leopold had no intention of paying workers or investing in infrastructure. Instead, he established a brutal system of forced labor and military terror. Villages were ordered to meet impossible rubber quotas. Failure meant death, or worse. To enforce obedience, Leopold employed the force publique, a private army made up of African conscripts and European officers. They were given rifles, quotas, and permission to do whatever was necessary. One of the most horrifying practices became the regime's grim signature: severed hands. Soldiers were required to account for every bullet used by presenting the severed right hand of a victim. In theory, this prevented waste. In practice, it turned human lives into currency. Entire villages were mutilated. Children's hands were cut off as warnings. People were tortured, raped, or burned alive. Entire communities disappeared into the forest and never returned. The goal wasn't just production, it was domination through fear. Reports of these atrocities began to leak out at the turn of the century. Missionaries, travelers, and journalists brought back photographs of mutilated children, piles of severed hands, and ghost towns emptied by terror. One British consular official, Roger Casement, conducted a formal investigation that shocked the world. Writers like Mark Twain and Arthur Conan Doyle condemned Leopold in scathing essays. The public outcry grew so intense that in 1908, the Belgian government was forced to take control of the Congo from Leopold. But by then, the damage was done. Historians estimate that between 8 to 10 million Congolese people died during Leopold's reign, from violence, starvation, overwork, and disease. That's nearly half the population of the region. And yet Leopold never stood trial. He died in his bed, surrounded by wealth, still denying responsibility. In Belgium, for decades, he was remembered not as a butcher, but as a builder. To this day, his statues still stand. The Congo's wounds have never truly healed. Generations of instability, poverty, and conflict can be traced back to the economic rape of its people and land. The horror Leopold unleashed wasn't a footnote in history. It was a warning ignored. All for rubber, all for profit, all while the world watched and applauded. Before Auschwitz, before the gas chambers, before the world vowed never again, there was Namibia, then known as German Southwest Africa. Between 1904 and 1908, the Herero and Nama peoples were nearly wiped from the earth, not by disease or famine, but by one of the first genocides of the 20th century, carried out with chilling intent, and later studied by the architects of the Nazi Holocaust. It began with resistance. The Herero people, long brutalized by German settlers and land seizures, rose up in 1904 under their leader Samuel Maharero. At first, they had some success, ambushing German patrols, reclaiming stolen cattle, striking at colonial outposts. Soon after, the Nama, another indigenous group facing displacement, also joined the uprising. Germany responded with overwhelming force and cruelty. General Lothar von Trotha was sent to crush the rebellion. He issued an order that remains one of the most horrific declarations in colonial history. Every Herero, with or without a gun, with or without cattle, will be shot. I no longer accept women or children. They must be driven into the desert. Thousands of Herero and Nama were forced into the Kalahari Desert, where German troops poisoned waterholes and set up patrols to kill anyone trying to escape. People died of thirst, starvation, and heat. Their bones littered the sands. Those who survived were sent to concentration camps, decades before Nazi Germany made them infamous. At Shark Island, prisoners were beaten, starved, and worked to death. German scientists came to experiment on the bodies. Skulls were shipped back to Europe for racial research. Some of those skulls were still stored in German universities until the 21st century. By the time the genocide ended, 80% of the Herero and 50% of the Nama populations were dead. Entire families, clans, and oral histories were erased. The survivors were stripped of their land, forced into servitude, and forbidden from owning livestock, a devastating blow in a pastoral culture. What's even more chilling is the intellectual legacy. Years later, many of the military officers, bureaucrats, and doctors who oversaw the Herero genocide would go on to influence Nazi ideology. The methods, forced labor, medical experiments, extermination orders, became a template. Eugen Fischer, a scientist who studied Herero skulls, would go on to mentor key Nazi racial theorists, including those who designed the policies of the Third Reich. Yet unlike the Holocaust, the Herero and Nama genocide was largely forgotten, not taught in German schools, not featured in museums, barely acknowledged by the global community for over a century. Only in recent years has Germany begun to confront its colonial crimes. In 2021, the German government officially recognized the genocide and offered a financial gesture, but stopped short of formal reparations. For the descendants of the victims, the loss remains personal, and the silence has always been political. This was not just a dry run for later horrors. It was a crime complete in itself, but it was committed in Africa, against Black people, and the world looked away. The scramble for Africa was violent, ruthless, and devastating, but it was not uncontested. From the forests of West Africa to the plains of East Africa, African leaders, warriors, and everyday people resisted colonization with everything they had. Yet their stories are often reduced to footnotes, overshadowed by narratives of passive submission or inevitable conquest. But resistance was never absent. It was constant. And in some places, it was victorious. Perhaps the most famous example is the Battle of Adwa in 1896. When Italy attempted to colonize Ethiopia, they were met with fierce resistance from Emperor Menelik II and his wife, Empress Teitu Betul. Mobilizing a massive, well-armed army, the Ethiopians launched a counterattack that shattered Italian forces. Over 4,000 Italian soldiers were killed or captured. Ethiopia remained independent, a beacon of African defiance and pride. In modern-day Tanzania, the Maji Maji Rebellion erupted in 1905. German colonialists had imposed brutal labor policies, forcing Africans to grow cotton for export. But a spiritual leader, Kinjekitile Ngwale, united dozens of ethnic groups under a common belief that sacred water, Maji, would protect them from bullets. Though the rebellion was ultimately crushed with horrific reprisals, it marked one of the earliest pan-ethnic uprisings on the continent. In Ghana, then called the Gold Coast, the legendary Ya Asantewa led the Ashanti in one of the final wars against British rule in 1900. When British authorities exiled the Ashanti king and demanded the sacred golden stool, a symbol of national soul, Ya Asantewa, the Queen Mother, stood up. "If you, the men, will not go forward, then we will. We, the women, will." Her leadership ignited a war that, though unsuccessful militarily, became a symbol of feminist and anti-colonial resistance. And these were just a few among many. The Zulu resisted the British under Cetshwayo in the 1879 Anglo-Zulu War, famously defeating British troops at the Battle of Isandlwana. The Bambara in Mali, the Ndebele in Zimbabwe, the Dervishes in Somalia, all fought, bled, and defied the imperial machine. But colonial narratives had a vested interest in portraying Africans as submissive or primitive, because acknowledging resistance meant acknowledging humanity. It meant admitting fear. It meant the colonizers weren't gods. So the stories were buried, the names erased. Yet the legacy of these warriors lives on, in songs, oral history, monuments, and the quiet pride of descendants who still remember. They didn't fight because they thought they would win. They fought because freedom was worth dying for. Colonialism didn't just conquer land, it reprogrammed it. The European powers didn't build in Africa to develop nations, they built to extract. Every school, every road, every railway line was designed with one purpose in mind: to funnel resources out, not to lift people up. The railroads didn't connect African cities to each other. They connected mines to ports, plantations to cargo ships. Everything pointed outward, toward Europe. Education was no different. Where it existed, it was shallow by design. Colonizers weren't interested in creating doctors, engineers, or scholars. They wanted clerks, translators, and obedient laborers. People trained just enough to serve the system, never to question it. In British colonies, the curriculum often revolved around European history, Christian doctrine, and colonial loyalty. In French territories, the system aimed to create Black Frenchmen, citizens in language, dress, and thought, but never in power. What was taught wasn't empowerment, it was assimilation. Meanwhile, traditional systems of knowledge, oral history, indigenous medicine, ecological expertise were dismissed as primitive. Languages were banned in schools. Spiritual leaders were labeled witches. Cultural memory was treated like a disease to be cured. And then there was the economy, a machine built for extraction, not growth. Colonies were forced into monocrop economies: Ghana for cocoa, Kenya for tea, Congo for rubber, Nigeria for palm oil. This made local economies completely dependent on global prices and ensured they could never stand on their own. Local industries were deliberately suppressed. Manufacturing was discouraged or outright banned to avoid competition with European goods. African entrepreneurs were taxed, harassed, or ignored, while foreign companies received subsidies and protection. Even systems of governance were reshaped to fracture societies from within. Colonizers exploited ethnic rivalries, created artificial hierarchies, and ruled through a strategy of divide and conquer. In many colonies, minority groups were empowered to govern majority populations, sowing seeds of resentment that exploded after independence. The legacy of that system is visible today, in the form of underdeveloped infrastructure, underfunded schools, and economies still hooked on raw exports. But this wasn't failure. It was design. Colonialism did not build broken nations by accident. It engineered them that way, to ensure Europe remained strong while Africa remained dependent. And when the flags finally came down, they left behind borders that didn't fit, institutions that didn't function, and wounds that still haven't healed. Because empires don't just steal wealth, they steal futures. The Berlin Conference ended in 1885, but the decisions made there still echo through every corner of Africa, not as whispers from the past, but as shouts in the present. The map drawn that year, clean lines, straight edges, perfect squares, became a blueprint for chaos. It forced ancient enemies into fragile unions. It tore apart unified cultures. And when independence finally came in the mid-20th century, African nations were left to govern a patchwork of wounds stitched together with foreign thread. The consequences have been catastrophic and long-lasting. In Nigeria, British colonizers lumped together the House of Fulani in the north, the Yoruba in the west, and the Igbo in the east. Three powerful groups with distinct religions, histories, and rivalries. The result? A country plagued by coups, civil war, and deep-seated mistrust. The scars of colonially drawn borders led directly to the Biafran War, where over 1 million people, mostly civilians, died. In Sudan, the North-South divide, amplified by British-Egyptian colonial policy, fueled decades of war, famine, and finally a split. The birth of South Sudan, now itself struggling under the weight of competing ethnic identities and limited infrastructure. In Rwanda, colonial powers institutionalized ethnic classification, reinforcing divisions between Hutu and Tutsi that culminated in the 1994 genocide, one of the fastest and most brutal mass killings in modern history. These are not isolated tragedies. They are part of a pattern, conflicts rooted in colonial fragmentation, aggravated by weak institutions, and often exploited by external interests still hungry for African resources. Even beyond conflict, the map of 1885 still holds Africa in a stranglehold. It shapes aid distribution, trade routes, visa systems, and educational structures, all influenced by the ghost of empire. It fosters identity crises, where people struggle to define themselves within artificial nations that never represented their heritage. And while former colonial powers now speak of partnership, investment, and diplomacy, many of them have never formally apologized, let alone made meaningful reparations. Today, Africa is rising, building, innovating, healing. But the process is slow, not because of some flaw in its people, but because the starting line was deliberately placed a mile behind everyone else. The blood spilled at colonial checkpoints didn't dry with independence. It still stains the soil. In every child displaced by civil war, in every refugee crossing borders that make no sense, in every conflict fueled by foreign arms sold in silence. The lines drawn in 1885 were never erased. They were simply made invisible until they bled again. The story of the scramble for Africa is not ancient history. It's not something buried in textbooks or sealed behind museum glass. It's alive. In the pain of civil wars, in the borders that make no sense, in the silence that follows when a child asks why their country is divided. What happened in Berlin in 1885 was not just the drawing of lines. It was the drawing of fates, the quiet signing of death warrants, the start of a theft so massive the world still struggles to count the cost. And while some nations have moved on, Others never had the chance. Justice was never served, reparations were never paid, and the stories, the true stories, were rarely told. Instead, Africa was cast as a continent of chaos, its greatness erased so its suffering could be blamed on itself. But history remembers, and so must we. Because to ignore the past is to repeat its violence, not with bullets and boots, but with indifference. Understand Africa today, you must understand what was done to it yesterday. And to honor its future, you must listen. Not to the victors, but to the voices buried beneath the borders. The map was drawn in ink, but it was sealed in blood.